They told him to kneel before a god, but no one warned the god what would happen if he didn't. The first thing Ethan Cole noticed wasn't the throne. It was the air, thick and metallic, like a summer storm trapped inside steel, every breath tasting faintly of burned circuitry as the gravity field pressed just a little too heavy against his shoulders, forcing most beings in the chamber to bow, whether they chose to or not. But not him, not entirely. His boots scraping across the polished obsidian floor as the restraints around his wrists hummed with a low electric whisper, calibrated to keep him compliant, not broken, a living offering. That's what they had called him, a tribute dragged across 3 systems and presented under a ceiling that glowed like a frozen aurora stretching nearly 100 feet above him, colors shifting slow and deliberate as if the structure itself was alive and watching. And then the murmurs stopped, not faded, stopped, like someone had cut the sound out of reality, because she leaned forward. Queen Virelia didn't move the way humans did. There was no wasted motion, just a smooth, controlled shift of something far more precise. Her form unfolding from the throne like light taking shape, tall enough that even at a distance of 30 feet, she dominated the space. Her skin carrying that impossible blue sheen, not painted or reflective but alive, iridescent patterns sliding beneath the surface like tides under glass. And when her gaze settled on him, Ethan felt it before he fully saw it, like standing too close to a high-voltage line, the fine hairs along his arms lifting, his heartbeat syncing with something that wasn't his, the chamber's systems reacting, recalibrating, trying to decide what he was, what he meant, and failing. A human, she said, and it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Her voice carried the way pressure does before a storm breaks, soft but unavoidable, and then she inhaled, not dramatically, just a measured breath that seemed to pull the air itself toward her, and for a fraction of a second Ethan felt it. A subtle tug inside his chest, not pain, not fear, something stranger, like his body was being studied without being touched, analyzed at a level he couldn't see, and yet his knees didn't give, the field tightened, the restraints adjusted, a quiet chime echoing from somewhere above as unseen systems flagged a deviation, and that's when it happened. The smallest thing, almost nothing at all. Her posture shifted again, just slightly, as if something about him had interrupted a pattern that had never been interrupted before, her head tilting a fraction of an inch, her luminous eyes narrowing not in anger, not in dominance, but in focus, in curiosity, like she was looking at a star that refused to follow its orbit, and Ethan, breathing steady despite the weight in the air, met her gaze and didn't look away, not because he was brave, not because he was reckless, but because somewhere deep in the part of him that had survived things no one was meant to survive, he understood one simple truth. If he knelt now, he would disappear, just another offering lost in a system that didn't remember names. So he stayed standing, shoulders squared, chains humming, heart steady. And for the first time in a chamber built to enforce submission, someone, hesitated. The silence did not break, it stretched, thin and fragile, like glass under pressure, as if the entire chamber was waiting for reality to correct itself, for the human to drop, to bend, to obey. But Ethan Cole remained standing, his boots planted against the cold obsidian as the field intensified by fractions, invisible forces pressing down with the weight of expectation rather than force, and somewhere above, unseen systems adjusted again, soft chimes layering over one another in quiet confusion, a language of machines that had never needed to question their own authority until now. And still he did not kneel. Queen Virelia's gaze did not leave him, not for a second, her eyes tracing him the way a scientist might study an anomaly. Except there was something else there now, something less precise, less controlled, like a variable she had not accounted for. And when she moved again, it was closer this time, not in distance, but in presence, the air shifting as though it recognized her intent before the motion itself completed, her form descending from the throne with effortless grace, each step silent despite the scale of her, until she stood no more than 10 feet away, close enough that Ethan could see the faint patterns moving beneath her skin, like light traveling through water, slow and deliberate, responding to something deeper than muscle or thought. The restraints around his wrists tightened briefly, reacting to proximity, A gentle warning rather than a command, and Ethan felt it, the subtle increase in pressure, the system reminding him of his place. But he did not react, not outwardly. Only a slow inhale, steady, controlled, the kind that had carried him through worse than this. And for a moment, just a moment, the queen mirrored it, her chest rising in a rhythm that did not quite match her own kind's natural cadence, as if she were unconsciously aligning with his. "You resist," she said, and her voice was quieter now, not weaker, but more focused, directed entirely at him rather than the chamber, and the words carried no accusation, only observation, and something like interest. "All others do not." And Ethan almost smiled, not out of humor, but recognition, because he had heard that tone before, not from queens or empires, but from people who were realizing, for the first time, that their understanding of the world was incomplete. "Maybe they never had a reason not to," he replied, his voice steady despite the weight in the air, and the words seemed to ripple outward, not loud, not defiant, just present, undeniable. And for a fraction of a second, something shifted again, not in the chamber, but in her, her head tilting ever so slightly, as if recalibrating, as if the answer had introduced a new axis to a system that had always been linear. The lights above dimmed by a fraction, responding to her internal state, subtle but noticeable. And the hum of the chamber softened, like a held breath. She stepped closer, now within reach, though she did not touch him, not yet, her gaze moving across his face, his posture, the small signs of strain that he refused to show. And then she inhaled again, slower this time, deliberate, as if testing a hypothesis, and Ethan felt it more clearly now, not a pull, but a presence, like standing near heat without being burned, something probing, searching for a reaction that never came, and that was when the first real fracture appeared, not in the empire, not in the systems, but in her certainty, because for the first time since she had taken the throne, the universe had presented her with something that did not behave the way it was supposed to, and instead of forcing it to change, she hesitated. The chamber did not return to normal because normal no longer applied. The air holding that same fragile tension as Queen Virilia stood within arm's reach of Ethan Cole, her presence no longer distant or untouchable but immediate, undeniable, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable, and the systems above them began to whisper again, softer this time, less certain, as if even they were recalculating what authority meant in the presence of something they could not quantify. Ethan could feel the change, not just in the pressure field that had stopped increasing, but in the rhythm of the space itself, the subtle hum that had once enforced order now uneven. Like a machine encountering resistance it was never designed to overcome, and still he did not move, not because he was defying her, but because there was nothing left to adjust, no instinct telling him to lower his gaze or shift his stance. Only the quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be decided by force. Virilia's eyes moved across him again, slower now, more deliberate, taking in details that had not mattered before, the rise and fall of his chest, the steadiness of his breathing, the absence of the expected physiological responses that her kind had spent generations perfecting the ability to trigger. And when she spoke again, it was not to the chamber, not to the unseen council observing from beyond the glowing walls, but to him alone. "Your kind does not register," she said, the words measured, each one placed with precision, but lacking the finality they once carried, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the statement without submitting to it. "We register just fine," he answered, his voice calm, grounded, the kind of tone used when explaining something simple to someone who had never needed to understand it before. "Just not the way you expect." And something in that answer settled into the space between them, not as a challenge, but as a fact, and for the first time, the queen did not immediately respond. Instead, she reached out, slow enough that the motion could be stopped at any moment, her hand hovering inches from his face, close enough that Ethan could feel the faint shift in temperature, the subtle warmth radiating from her skin, and the systems reacted instantly, a low tone pulsing through the chamber as if warning against contact, as if reminding her of protocols that had never been questioned. But she did not withdraw, not this time, her fingers pausing just short of touching him, as if waiting for something, Permission perhaps, or confirmation, something her kind had never needed to ask for. And Ethan, watching her, understanding more than he should have in a place like this, did not step back, did not lean in. He simply remained where he was, present, unguarded, and that was enough. Her fingertips brushed his skin, light, almost hesitant, and the reaction was immediate, not from him, but from everything around them, the lights flickering by a fraction, the hum of the chamber stuttering, as if the system itself could not process the simplicity of the act. No submission, no dominance, just contact, and Virilia inhaled again, sharply this time, not in control, but in surprise, her posture shifting in a way that broke the perfect symmetry she had maintained since the moment he entered, and Ethan felt it too, not as a force, but as a realization, something passing between them that had nothing to do with power or hierarchy, something quieter, more dangerous in its own way, because it could not be contained, and in the silence that followed, one truth became clear, not spoken, not declared, but understood. The human was not the anomaly anymore. The system was. The moment her fingers touched him did not end. It echoed, spreading through the chamber like a ripple through still water, subtle but undeniable, and the systems above reacted again, not with alarms this time, but with uncertainty, the soft tones shifting into something uneven, as if the architecture itself could not decide whether what it was witnessing was permitted or forbidden, and Queen Virilia did not pull her hand away. Not immediately, her fingertips resting lightly against Ethan Cole's skin as though confirming that he was real, that the anomaly was not a misreading or a fault in her perception, and Ethan remained still, not frozen, not tense, simply present, his breathing steady, his gaze level with hers, and that steadiness became its own kind of disruption, something the chamber had no protocol for. Around them, the distant figures that lined the perimeter of the hall, silent observers cloaked in shadow and light, began to shift, not physically, but in attention, their collective focus tightening as the unspoken rules of the empire bent in a way they had not bent before. And then the voice came, not from a single point, but from everywhere at once, layered and controlled, the tone of a council that had never needed to raise its volume to be obeyed. The subject is non-compliant, it said, each word precise, devoid of emotion. Deviation exceeds acceptable parameters, and the words hung in the air, not as a threat, but as a conclusion, a calculation already made, a path already chosen, and for a brief moment, nothing moved. Ethan felt it before he understood it, the shift in the field, not stronger, but colder, more deliberate, the kind of adjustment that came with decision rather than reaction. An instinct brushed against the back of his mind, quiet but present, the same instinct that had kept him alive long enough to stand here now. But he did not act on it. Not yet, because the only thing that mattered in that moment was not the system, not the council, but the figure standing in front of him. Virilia's hand withdrew slowly, not in retreat, but in thought, her gaze breaking from his face for the first time since she had approached, turning slightly upward as if she could see beyond the glowing ceiling, beyond the walls, to the minds that had just spoken. And when she answered, her voice carried something new, not defiance, not submission, but consideration. Parameters are based on expectation, she said, each word measured, but no longer absolute. Expectation is incomplete, and the chamber responded to her words the way it had responded to everything she had ever said, with immediate, total alignment. Except this time, there was a delay, a fraction of a second where nothing adjusted, nothing corrected, as if the system itself hesitated. Ethan watched her, not fully understanding the scale of what was happening, but recognizing the pattern, the same one he had seen in people who were beginning to question something they had always accepted as truth. And there was a quiet shift inside him too, something that was not fear, not hope, but awareness, the realization that whatever this was, whatever line they had just crossed, there was no stepping back from it. The voice returned, sharper now, though still controlled. Correction is required, it stated, and the words carried weight. Not physical, but structural, like the foundation of something ancient pressing down to reassert itself. And for the first time, Ethan felt the field tighten again, not to force him down, but to isolate him, to define him, to turn him from presence into object, from anomaly into solution, and he exhaled slowly, the sound quiet in the vastness of the chamber, and when he spoke, it was not to the council, not to the system, but to her. "You do not have to follow that," he said, simple, direct. The kind of statement that did not belong in a place like this, and yet it settled into the space between them with more weight than any command that had come before, and Virilia, standing at the center of an empire that had never needed to question itself, looked at him again, not as a subject, not as a variable, but as something else entirely, something that did not fit within any structure she had inherited. And for the second time since he entered the chamber, she hesitated. The pressure in the chamber did not rise all at once. It settled in layers, deliberate and controlled, like a system tightening its grip not out of panic but certainty, and Ethan Cole felt it along his spine, in the subtle resistance of the air, in the way his lungs had to work just a little harder to pull each breath, not enough to break him, just enough to remind him that something vast and ancient had decided to act. And above them the aurora-lit ceiling dimmed by a fraction, colors slowing, as if the structure itself was narrowing its focus. "Correction will proceed," the voice stated again, more defined now, less distant, no longer observing but intervening, and the hum beneath Ethan's feet shifted into a deeper frequency, one that resonated through bone rather than air, and still he did not move, not because he believed he could resist it, but because he had already made his choice the moment he chose not to kneel. Across from him, Queen Virilia stood motionless, but the stillness was different now, no longer the perfect, unchanging composure of a ruler who had never been challenged, but something more complex, something that carried weight behind it, her gaze lifting once more toward the unseen council, and for a brief moment Ethan thought she might step back, might let the system do what it had always done, correct the anomaly, restore balance, continue forward as if this moment had never existed. But she did not move. Instead, her eyes returned to him, and there was something in them now that had not been there before, not curiosity alone, not analysis, but recognition, as if she had reached a conclusion that could not be undone. The field tightened again, isolating Ethan further, defining the space around him with invisible boundaries, turning him into a variable that could be adjusted, contained, resolved. And he exhaled slowly, steady as before, his shoulders relaxing instead of tensing, the opposite of what the system expected, and that alone seemed to create another ripple through the chamber, subtle but real. "You said expectation is incomplete," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the layered hum without force, without defiance, just clarity. And for a moment the words seemed too small for a place like this, too simple to matter. But they settled into the space between them, and Virilia's posture shifted again, not away from him, but towards something new, something uncharted. "It is," she replied, and this time there was no delay in her voice, no uncertainty in the delivery, only the weight of a decision forming in real time, and correction based on incomplete expectation. She paused, not because she lacked the words, but because she was choosing them, shaping them, something she had never needed to do before. "Is error," and the chamber reacted immediately, not with alignment, but with resistance, the hum distorting, the lights flickering by degrees too small to alarm but too precise to ignore, as if the system itself was pushing back against the statement. The voice returned, sharper now, no longer neutral. Authority deviation detected, it said, and for the first time there was something beneath the words, not emotion, but urgency, a shift from observation to containment. "Reassert control," and the pressure around Ethan increased again, more focused, more deliberate, and this time he felt it in his knees, a subtle pull downward, not enough to force him, but enough to suggest what should happen next, what had always happened next for every other being brought into this chamber. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in fear, but in awareness, and he glanced at her, just for a second, not asking, not pleading, just acknowledging that whatever happened now was not his decision to make. Virilia did not look away, and in that moment, the vast distance between them, between human and queen, between anomaly and empire, collapsed into something smaller, something immediate, and when she moved, it was not a retreat, not a step back towards safety or tradition, but a single, deliberate step forward, placing herself fully between him and the unseen authority that had governed everything she had ever known, and the chamber did not know how to respond. The chamber did not collapse into chaos when she stepped in front of him. It did something far more unsettling. It paused, as if the very systems that governed it had reached a point where their calculations no longer produced a clear outcome. And for the first time since Ethan Cole had been dragged into that vast hall, the pressure field stopped tightening, not because the order had been withdrawn, but because it no longer knew how to proceed. The aurora above dimmed further, its flowing colors slowing into long, stretched bands of light that seemed to hold their breath, and the hum beneath his feet fractured into uneven pulses, like a machine trying to correct itself while lacking the data to do so. And Ethan felt the shift immediately, the weight on his body easing by a fraction, not enough to free him, but enough to tell him that something fundamental had changed. Queen Virilia stood between him and the unseen authority, her posture no longer aligned with the throne behind her, no longer an extension of the system, but something separate, something independent. And when she spoke, her voice did not carry upward in obedience. It moved outward, steady and controlled. Control has been redefined, she said, and the words did not echo the way commands usually did in that chamber. They lingered, as if the space itself was uncertain whether to accept them, and the response came instantly, sharper than before, layered voices converging into one unified tone. Control is absolute, it declared. Deviation is instability. And this time the pressure returned, not as a blanket force, but as something more precise, more targeted, the field narrowing around Ethan again, attempting to isolate the anomaly, to reduce him to a problem that could be solved. Ethan drew in a slow breath, the metallic taste of the air, still present, still real, and he could feel the system trying again, trying to define him, to push him into a shape it could understand. And for a moment, just a moment, his body reacted, his muscles tightening against the invisible force, his balance shifting by an inch, the kind of small movement that would have gone unnoticed anywhere else. But here, in a place that measured everything, it registered instantly. The chamber responded with a low, rising tone, as if encouraged, as if the system believed it was regaining control, and Ethan felt it, the subtle pull downward returning, the suggestion becoming stronger, more insistent, and he closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, not in surrender, but in focus, grounding himself in something the system could not touch, something it could not quantify. And when he opened them again, he did not look at the ceiling, he did not look at the invisible council. He looked at her. Virilia did not turn back toward the throne, did not acknowledge the command that had defined her existence until this moment, her attention fixed entirely on him. And there was something in her expression now that had no place in the empire she ruled, something unstructured, unmeasured, something that could not be reduced to data or protocol. And as the pressure increased again, as the system pushed harder, she took another step forward, closing the distance completely, her presence cutting through the field in a way that made the surrounding air distort, not violently, but unmistakably, and the hum of the chamber broke, not into silence, but into something irregular, something unstable. If control is absolute, she said, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that pressed against every surface in the room, then it must include the capacity to change. And the statement did not align with the system. It did not fit within its parameters. And for a moment, nothing responded, no correction, no reinforcement, just a gap, a void where certainty should have been. And Ethan felt it as clearly as he felt the air in his lungs, the absence of something that had always been there, the first true break in a structure that had never fractured. And in that silence, standing inches from a being who had been defined as a variable, Queen Virilia made a choice that no system had prepared her for. The silence that followed her words did not feel empty. It felt suspended, like something immense had been lifted just enough to reveal the space beneath it. And Ethan Cole could feel it in the way the air no longer pressed with certainty, but hovered with hesitation. The chamber itself caught between two definitions of reality, one that had always been absolute, and one that had just been spoken into existence. The aurora above them flickered again, not in response to a command, but in reaction to contradiction. its colors fragmenting into thinner strands of light that no longer moved in perfect synchronization, and the hum beneath his feet shifted into an uneven rhythm that no longer carried authority, only function, as if the system was still running but no longer fully in control of what it was running. The voice did not return immediately this time, and that absence carried more weight than any command, stretching across the chamber in a way that made even the distant observers hold their positions more rigidly, as if movement itself might trigger something irreversible, and Ethan realized, not through logic but through instinct, that this was not just a pause, it was a fracture, the kind that does not announce itself but changes everything that follows. Virilia stood unmoving, her form still between him and the unseen council, but the stillness was no longer a posture, it was a decision held in place. Her gaze fixed forward, not upward, not downward, but directly ahead, as if she had redefined the direction of authority itself, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a clarity that had not existed before. "You measure stability by sameness," she said, each word steady, grounded. "But sameness is not stability." And the statement moved through the chamber like a new frequency, something the systems could detect but not interpret, something that did not align with any known pattern. The response came slower this time, delayed by a fraction. That would have been imperceptible anywhere else, but here it was everything. "Variance introduces risk," the voice replied, less unified now, the layered tones no longer perfectly synchronized. "Risk must be eliminated." And as the words settled, the field around Ethan shifted again, not stronger, but more complex, multiple layers overlapping, attempting to define him from different angles at once, as if the system was trying every possible configuration to force a resolution. Ethan felt it, the subtle pulse, the pressure adjusting in ways that were no longer linear, and for a moment his breath caught, not from fear, but from the sheer complexity of it, the way the system was adapting in real time. And yet, even as it adjusted, it failed to find what it was looking for, because there was nothing to align him to, no pattern to match, no response to trigger. He steadied himself again, feet firm against the floor, shoulders relaxed, and when he spoke, it was quieter than before, but somehow more present. Or maybe risk is how you learn what you missed, and the words did not challenge the system. They bypassed it entirely, landing somewhere else, somewhere deeper. Virilia turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him again, and this time there was no analysis in her gaze, no attempt to categorize or measure, only recognition. The kind that forms when something has already changed and cannot be returned to what it was, and for a moment, the distance between them vanished completely, not physically, but in meaning, two beings standing in the same space, not as ruler and subject, not as system and anomaly, but as something new, something undefined. The chamber responded with another shift, the hum dropping into a lower register, the lights dimming by another fraction, and then the voice returned. But it was different now, no longer unified, no longer certain. Authority conflict detected, it said. The words slightly out of phase with themselves, resolution required. And for the first time, it did not state how that resolution would occur, and in that gap, in that absence of instruction, Ethan understood something that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with choice. The system was no longer leading, it was waiting, and what happened next would not be calculated, it would be decided. The chamber did not rush to resolve the conflict. It lingered in it, stretched thin between what had always been and what was beginning to exist, and Ethan Cole felt that tension settle into his bones, not as pressure, but as possibility, the kind that carried no guarantees and no instructions, only the quiet understanding that something irreversible was already in motion. The aurora above fractured further, its colors no longer flowing in harmony but drifting in separate currents, slow and uncertain, like thoughts that had lost their single direction, and the hum beneath his feet dropped again, lower now, almost imperceptible, as if the system was conserving itself, retreating into analysis instead of action. Queen Virilia did not move immediately, her presence still forming a barrier between him and the unseen authority, but the nature of that barrier had changed. It was no longer imposed by power, it was chosen, and that difference carried more weight than anything the system had attempted. Resolution. She repeated softly, as if testing the word itself, not as a command, but as a concept. And for the first time since Ethan had entered the chamber, she turned fully away from the throne, not partially, not in hesitation, but completely, her body aligning not with the structure behind her, but with the human standing before her. And the chamber responded with a subtle distortion, a ripple that passed through the air like a shift in gravity, not enough to destabilize, but enough to mark the moment. The voice answered again, but it no longer sounded unified, the layers misaligned by fractions. Resolution must restore order, it said, though the certainty that once defined it was thinning. Authority must remain singular. And as the words settled, the field around Ethan did not tighten, it recalibrated, drawing inward with precision, isolating him more completely than before, defining him as the center of the instability, the variable that required elimination from the equation. And Ethan felt it clearly now, the narrowing of space, the way the system was attempting to reduce him, not physically, but conceptually, to turn him into something that could be solved. He exhaled slowly, the metallic taste still present, grounding him in something real, something the system could not rewrite. And when he looked at Virilia, there was no expectation in his gaze, no demand, only presence, the same quiet certainty he had carried from the beginning. "You said it needs to be resolved," he said, his voice steady, cutting cleanly through the layered hum. "Then do not resolve me." And the words hung there, simple, direct, but carrying a meaning that extended far beyond them. And Virilia's eyes met his, fully this time. No analysis, no calculation, just understanding forming in real time. The kind that does not come from data but from recognition. She stepped closer, closing the final inches between them, her presence no longer overwhelming but aligned, her scale still vast, her form still radiant, but no longer distant. And when she spoke, her voice carried something new, something the chamber had never processed before. "Resolution does not require removal," she said, each word steady, grounded in something deeper than protocol. "It requires understanding." And the chamber reacted instantly, not with correction, but with resistance, the hum spiking, briefly before collapsing into a fractured pattern, the lights flickering in uneven pulses, and the voice responded, sharper now, almost strained. "Understanding introduces unpredictability," it said, the layers slipping further out of sync. "Unpredictability threatens continuity." And for a moment, everything held, suspended between those definitions. And then Virilia did something no ruler of her empire had ever done. She reached back, not toward the throne, not toward the system, but toward the restraints binding Ethan's wrists, her fingers hovering over the faintly glowing locks as the chamber pulsed around them, waiting. And in that moment, the decision was no longer theoretical, it was physical, immediate, and irreversible. Her fingers hovered over the restraints, not touching yet, not activating anything, but close enough that the faint glow reflected across her iridescent skin. And Ethan Cole felt the entire chamber narrow around that single point, as if every system, every observer, every layer of authority had condensed into the space between her hand and the metal at his wrists. The hum beneath his feet climbed again, not smooth, not controlled, but fractured, unstable, like a system reaching the edge of its design limits. And the aurora above flickered in uneven pulses, colors breaking apart into sharp, disjointed streaks that no longer flowed, only reacted. Unauthorized interaction detected, the voice said, but it no longer sounded absolute, the layers slipping further out of alignment, each tone arriving a fraction of a second too late. Restrained integrity must be maintained, and the field around Ethan tightened again, not to force him down, but to hold him in place, to prevent deviation from escalating. And he felt it in the way his arms grew heavier, the subtle resistance in every small movement, the system trying to lock him into a fixed state, something predictable, something safe. He did not fight it, did not pull against the restraints, only shifted his focus to her, to the way her hand remained steady, despite the growing distortion in the chamber, to the way her breathing had changed, no longer perfectly measured, but slightly irregular, like something inside her was no longer following the patterns she had always known. If you do this, the voice continued, sharper now, more urgent. Continuity cannot be guaranteed, and the words carried weight, not just as a warning, but as a truth the system believed completely. And for a moment, just a moment, Ethan saw it reflected in her posture. The smallest hesitation, not fear, not doubt, but awareness of consequence. The understanding that whatever came next would not be contained, would not be reversible. And then she exhaled slowly, the motion deliberate, grounding, and when her fingers finally made contact with the restraint, the reaction was immediate. The chamber pulsed, not violently, but intensely, the hum spiking into a sharp resonance that echoed through the structure, the lights flaring and dimming in rapid succession as if the system was trying to stabilize something that refused to stabilize, and Ethan felt the lock at his wrist shift, not opening yet, but recognizing the command, recognizing her authority even as the system struggled to accept it. Authority conflict unresolved. The voice said, the layers now clearly out of sync, overlapping and distorting each other. Reassert. The statement cut off mid-phrase, not silenced, but interrupted, as if something had overridden the sequence before it could complete. And in that fraction of a second, something deeper than protocol moved through the chamber, something that did not belong to the system at all. Virelia's hand remained steady, her fingers pressing lightly against the restraint as if she was feeling it, understanding it, not as a mechanism, but as a choice. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not force, it settled into the space with quiet certainty. Continuity is not preserved by control, she said, each word clear, despite the distortion around them. It is preserved by what survives change. And the lock responded, a soft shift, almost imperceptible, but real, the first sign that the system was no longer the only authority acting within the chamber. Ethan felt it immediately, the subtle release of tension around his wrist, the smallest fraction of freedom, not enough to remove the restraint, but enough to change what it meant. And he looked at her, not in surprise, not in disbelief, but in recognition, because this was no longer about him, no longer about survival. This was something larger, something unfolding in real time. And for the first time since he had been brought here, he understood that the outcome was not being calculated. It was being chosen, one action at a time. The faint release at Ethan Cole's wrist did not feel like freedom, not yet. It felt like a shift in meaning, a single variable rewritten inside a system that had never allowed change, and the chamber reacted as if it had lost a point of reference, the hum beneath his feet breaking into uneven waves, rising and falling without pattern, while the aurora above fractured further into sharp, disconnected ribbons of light that no longer followed any unified flow. Queen Virelia did not withdraw her hand, her fingers still resting against the restraint as though anchoring the moment, and Ethan could see it now, the difference in her, not just in posture or voice, but in presence. She was no longer aligned with the structure around her. She stood apart from it, not outside it, but no longer defined by it, and that distinction carried a weight the chamber could not process. Containment failure escalating, the voice said, but it no longer sounded like a command, it sounded like a report. Fragmented and struggling to keep coherence, the layers slipping further out of alignment, stability threshold compromised, and the field around Ethan shifted again, not tightening, not releasing, but fluctuating, as if the system could no longer decide which state to enforce, and he felt it in the subtle pulses against his body, the alternating pressure that had lost its precision, its certainty. He flexed his fingers slightly, testing the restraint without pulling against it, and the response was immediate but inconsistent, the lock tightening for a fraction of a second before easing again, as if conflicting instructions were colliding within it. And he looked at her, not asking, not expecting, just present, because that was all he had ever been able to offer in a place like this. Virelia's gaze remained steady, fixed not on the restraint now, but on him, and there was something deeper in it, something that had moved beyond curiosity and into understanding. Not complete, not perfect, but real, the kind that forms when a system fails and something else takes its place. You are attempting to redefine authority. The voice continued, the tones now clearly desynchronized, overlapping and distorting each other. Redefinition is not permitted. And for a moment, the chamber seemed to brace itself, the hum compressing into a low, sustained frequency, the light stabilizing just enough to suggest that the system was gathering what control it had left, preparing to reassert itself in a final, unified attempt. Ethan felt it before it happened, the subtle shift in the air, the way the pressure began to align again, not fully, but enough to signal intent, and he exhaled slowly, steady as ever, his shoulders loosening instead of tightening, the same quiet defiance that had carried him this far, not loud, not aggressive, just unyielding in its simplicity. Authority is not something you keep, he said, his voice calm, cutting cleanly through the layered distortion. It is something others recognize. And the words landed in the chamber with a clarity that the system could not distort, not because they were powerful, but because they did not rely on power at all. Virelia's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough, a subtle softening in the rigid precision that had once defined her, and she turned her hand slightly, her fingers pressing more firmly against the restraint, not forcing it, not overriding it, but engaging with it in a way that acknowledged its function without submitting to it, and the lock responded again, this time with a clearer change, a quiet release that traveled through the mechanism, the faint glow dimming by a fraction as the system struggled to reconcile her authority with its own. The voice reacted instantly, but now it carried something new, not just distortion, but fragmentation, conflict unresolved. It said, the words splitting across multiple layers that no longer aligned, resolution path undefined, and the statement hung there, incomplete, lacking the conclusion that had always followed, and in that absence, in that gap where certainty should have been, the chamber did something it had never done before. It waited, not for a calculation, not for a command, but for a choice that could no longer be dictated by anything except the one who was making it. The chamber did not resolve the conflict, it leaned into it, every system suspended at the edge of a decision it could no longer compute, and Ethan Cole felt that stillness settle deeper than the pressure ever had, not heavy, not restrictive, but absolute in a different way, the kind that comes when something stops trying to control and starts waiting to understand. And for the first time since he had been brought there, the air did not feel like a tool, it felt like space. Queen Virelia's hand remained against the restraint, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged, but everything about her had shifted beyond recognition. No longer the extension of a perfect system, but something that existed alongside it, something that could choose without permission, and the chamber reacted to that existence with quiet instability, the aurora above holding its fractured form, no longer correcting itself, the hum beneath their feet settling into a low, uneven pulse that no longer dictated rhythm, only reflected it. Resolution path undefined, the voice repeated. But now it sounded less like a statement and more like an admission, the layered tones no longer attempting to align, each fragment carrying its own incomplete certainty, action required. And the words hung there, not directing, not commanding, but acknowledging that something had to move forward without instruction. Ethan felt the restraint shift again, a subtle easing that no longer resisted her touch, and he flexed his hand slightly, not pulling away, just testing the new space, the new definition, and it held, not because the system allowed it, but because it no longer fully controlled it. He looked at her, really. Looked this time, not at the scale or the presence, but at the change, the way her breathing had found a new rhythm, not perfectly measured, not dictated, but chosen, and there was something in that felt more powerful than anything the chamber had tried to enforce. You are waiting, he said quietly, the words simple, but precise, and Virelia's gaze met his, fully present, no distance, no hierarchy, just awareness. And for a moment, neither of them moved, not because they could not, but because the moment itself mattered, the space between decision and action carrying its own weight. The voice responded again, but now it was fractured beyond recognition, the tones overlapping, breaking apart, struggling to maintain coherence. Delay increases instability, it said, though the certainty behind the words had thinned to almost nothing. Immediate resolution recommended, and the chamber pulsed in response, not with force, but with urgency, the systems attempting one final Alignment, one last effort to restore a structure that was already slipping beyond its reach. Ethan exhaled slowly, steady as always, his shoulders relaxed, his stance unchanged, and when he spoke again, his voice carried no urgency at all, only clarity. Then stop trying to fix it, he said, and the words did not challenge the system. They bypassed it, landing somewhere deeper, somewhere it could not process. Virelia's expression shifted again, not in reaction, but in realization, something settling into place. Not because it had been calculated, but because it had been understood, and she turned her hand slightly, her fingers moving across the restraint with intention, not forcing, not overriding, but choosing, and the lock responded, not instantly, but inevitably, the faint glow dimming further, the mechanism releasing with a quiet finality that carried more weight than any command the chamber had ever issued. The restraint opened, not violently, not dramatically, just a simple separation, a boundary that no longer existed. And for a moment, everything stopped, not the hum, not the light, but the expectation, the assumption that the system would correct, would respond, would reassert itself. And when it did not, when nothing replaced what had just been removed, a new kind of silence filled the chamber, one that did not belong to control, but to possibility. And in that silence, standing free for the first time, Ethan did not step away, did not retreat. He simply remained where he was, because this had never been about escape. It had been about something else entirely, something that had just begun. The absence of the restraint did not trigger collapse. It revealed something quieter, something more profound, as the chamber continued to exist without correcting what had just been undone, and Ethan Cole felt it in the way the air settled around him. No longer pressing, no longer guiding, just present, neutral, like a space that had forgotten how to dictate what belonged inside it. The faint mark where the restraint had been still tingled along his wrist, not from force, but from contrast, from the sudden realization of what it meant to not be held. And yet he did not move, did not step away from Queen Virelia, because leaving was not the point, not anymore. The aurora above them remained fractured, but it had stopped flickering, the strands of color holding their separate paths as if they had accepted that they would not return to a single flow, and the hum beneath his feet settled into a low, steady pulse, no longer uneven, no longer strained, but different, a rhythm that did not enforce, only existed. Virelia lowered her hand slowly, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation, her posture no longer aligned with anything behind her, her presence fully her own. And when she looked at Ethan, there was no trace of the distance that had once defined them, only a quiet, grounded awareness, the kind that comes after something has already changed and cannot be reversed. The voice did not return immediately, and that silence stretched longer than any command had, filling the chamber with something unfamiliar, something that did not belong to control or correction. And when it finally spoke, it no longer sounded unified, no longer even attempted to align itself into a single authority, system state, undefined. It said, the words fragmented, the layers drifting apart. Primary directive, unclear. And for the first time, there was no follow-up, no instruction, no attempt to restore what had been lost, only acknowledgement of what no longer fit. Ethan drew in a slow breath, the metallic edge of the air softer now, less intrusive, and he glanced around the chamber, not searching for exits or threats, but noticing the details that had once been overshadowed by pressure. The distant figures along the perimeter no longer rigid in their stillness, their attention no longer unified, as if they too were caught in the same undefined space, no longer certain what they were witnessing or what it meant. It does not know what to do, he said quietly, not to challenge, not to explain, just to name what was already obvious. And Virelia's gaze followed his for a moment, taking in the chamber not as a ruler surveying her domain, but as someone seeing it without the framework that had always defined it. And when she spoke, her voice carried a calm that did not rely on authority. Then it will learn, she said, simple, direct, the words settling into the space without resistance, without distortion, as if they belonged there in a way nothing else had. The chamber did not react, not with force, not with correction, and that lack of response carried more meaning than anything before it. because it meant there was nothing left to enforce, nothing left to align, only something new to become. Ethan looked back at her, and for the first time, there was a faint shift in his expression, not relief, not victory, but recognition, the understanding that what had happened here was not an ending, not even a resolution, but the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, and still, neither of them stepped away, because whatever this was, whatever this space had become, it was not something to leave behind, it was something to stand within, together. The chamber did not return to what it had been. It did not restore its symmetry or reclaim its certainty. Instead it held its new shape, fractured yet stable, like something that had broken open only to discover it could still stand. And Ethan Cole remained where he was, not as a subject, not as a variable, but as a presence the system could no longer define, his hands free at his sides, the faint imprint of the restraint fading into something that no longer mattered. The air no longer tasted of control, only of space, open and unclaimed, and the aurora above drifted in separate currents that did not seek to merge again, each strand of light moving in its own quiet path, no longer forced into alignment. Queen Virelia stood beside him, not before, not above, but beside, her form still radiant, still immense, but no longer distant, and when she turned her gaze across the chamber, it was not as a ruler measuring compliance, but as someone seeing for the first time what had always been. Hidden beneath order, the countless possibilities that had never been allowed to exist. The distant figures along the perimeter no longer held their rigid stillness, subtle shifts passing between them, as if the change at the center had reached them without a single command, and the voice, once singular and absolute, did not attempt to reform itself, its fragments lingering at the edge of perception, no longer directing, only observing, uncertain, incomplete. Ethan drew in a slow breath, steady as ever, and glanced at her, not searching for instruction, not waiting for permission, only acknowledging what had already happened, and in that quiet exchange, there was no hierarchy left to define them, only understanding, fragile but real. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice calm, not urgent, because whatever came next would not be forced into existence. And Virelia did not answer immediately, her gaze lifting once more to the fractured light above, watching it move without constraint, without command, and for a moment, the chamber felt larger than it had before, not in size, but in meaning, a place no longer bound to a single outcome. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no weight of authority, only clarity. "Now," she said softly, "we begin to choose." And the words did not echo, did not trigger response. They simply existed, settling into the space as something entirely new, something the system could not measure or contain. Ethan nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and looked forward again, not toward an exit, not toward an end, but toward whatever would come next. And for the first time since he had been brought into that chamber, there was no sense of being trapped, no sense of being tested, only the quiet, unfamiliar feeling of standing in a place where nothing had been decided yet. The aurora continued to drift, the hum remained low and steady, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something the Empire had never known how to create, not control, not power, but possibility. And in that silence, the smallest shift occurred, not in the system, not in the structure, but in something far less visible, a recognition that did not need to be spoken, because it was already understood, that he had not been brought there to be measured, or broken, or even changed. He had been brought there to change something else entirely, and he had.